There we go. Hello and welcome everyone to what is hopefully going to be a fairly quick lecture, because I know you guys want to get, if you are with your family, want to get back to that. The We are talking today about the second half of the U.S. Civil War. Last time we talked more about like logistics and everything, and a little bit about U.S. strategy, but now we're talking about the war itself. So hold on a second while I hit this screen share button. There we go. So just as a reminder, we left off talking about like the grand strategy of that General Scott came up with, called the Anaconda Plan. Basically that the U.S. would surround the South, and then work our way south through the Mississippi. But Lincoln ended up scrapping that and choosing more to try to go after Richmond, which was a poor idea, because that did not succeed. And I have a very rowdy cat right now, so sorry if I have to break up the lecture trying to deal with this little guy. Okay, so that's where we left off, but it was leading towards what was kind of the bigger consideration for everyone when dealing with the when in terms of the grand strategy, because it didn't really matter if the South was able to fend off the Union or not. If they could get France or Britain to intervene, that would spell disaster for the Union. And so a lot of the strategy actually had more to do with foreign consideration. And the Confederacy had a number of strategies in terms of trying to deal with, in terms of trying to get Britain or France to actually join in and fight the Union on their behalf, kind of like what happened with the American Revolution. Because remember, France intervening during the Revolution was the decisive turning point in America's favor. And so their first strategy is what they called using King Cotton. And basically, they thought that cotton was such a necessary product in Britain, especially because of the Industrial Revolution, that they could use it as a bargaining chip. That they would essentially withhold cotton to Britain in order to get them to intervene. This didn't exactly go so well for them. So in 1861, right at the start of the war, they stopped shipping stopped shipping cotton to Britain, and also France and Germany. Germany wasn't actually a country yet; it was several other countries, but the largest one being Prussia. Basically, they just stopped shipping out cotton to everywhere other than Mexico. And Mexico actually was going through its own troubles, with France intervening there and imposing their own imposing an Austrian um, emperor there for a little bit. So Mexico was also not very much a viable alternative. Um, and by early 1862, the Union had pretty much, the Union blockade had made this strategy pretty much impossible anyways. They weren't, they wouldn't have been able to ship out cotton because of the Union blockade. But there's kind of a big concern when it comes to blockades and international law, because even at this point there was international law regarding blockades, and technically you can't blockade yourself and have other countries regard the blockade as legal. So technically, Britain was not supposed to, if Britain was supposed to regard the Confederacy as part of the United States, then they were supposed to disregard the blockade. This is actually kind of a telling problem because, the war's kind of about whether or not to recognize the Confederacy as an independent state, and yet, that blockade kind of says that it's an independent state. You can't blockade yourself. And but the British government did not officially disregard the blockade, though they would end up paying for private citizens who did after the war. But this didn't really work. Britain never turned because of the loss of King Cotton. Although, starting in 1861 and throughout the rest of the war, Lancaster, the big industrial hub of Britain, had a what's called the Lancaster cotton famine, and basically, a lot of textile factories ceased to function without Southern cotton. So this was a huge problem for them. And starting on November 8th of 1861, the U.S. blockade actually stopped a batch of dignitaries going from the Confederacy toward Britain on a ship called the Trent. This is known as the Trent Affair. And this was seen as an act of war because those were officials that were going to Britain. They actually were caught fairly close to British shores, not in the blockade itself, but over in British waters. So Britain actually started preparing to go to war over this. It came dang close, especially in December, when they started readying troops in Nova Scotia to invade the U.S. And so Lincoln officially released the diplomats and allowed them to go on their way, even though, they were from the Confederacy, which he did not recognize as an independent country. But eventually Britain decided to switch its source of cotton and started having India grow all of its cotton from then on. So it's the Civil War that makes Britain switch its main source of cotton from the South to India. but throughout the rest of the Civil War, they would still not have enough cotton to really drive their industry in Lancaster. So King Cotton was kind of doing its job. Also, because the U.S. was so focused on trying to keep the Confederacy bottled up by its blockade, the Monroe foreign countries kind of saw this as an opportunity to violate the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, we've talked about the Monroe Doctrine back in the 1820s during the era of good feelings, that the U.S. pledged to end European interference in the Western Hemisphere, um, and and the European powers saw this as an opportunity. With I just mentioned earlier about France intervening in Mexico and installing their own um, emperor. So they intervened in December of 1861. So, just a few months after the Civil War started, but they wouldn't actually install the emperor until 1864. So there was a long period of time in which France was just occupying Mexico. And the U.S. couldn't do anything about it, despite the fact that it very openly violated the Monroe Doctrine, because, well, the U.S. was too busy dealing with the with the Civil War. Spain also recaptured the Dominican Republic, who had actually gained independence for a little bit, in 1863 as well. So the European countries were actually seeing this as an opportunity for them to intervene. And this was, especially what was happening in Mexico, was really good for the Confederacy because they thought that they could get France on their side. But the issue of slavery remained kind of the key reason why these foreign powers did not intervene. They understood that the South had seceded to sustain slavery, and all of these foreign powers, with the exception of Spain, had actually outlawed slavery prior to the Civil War. Britain did it in 1833. France had actually done it in the 1790s, but Napoleon I reinaugurated it, and it wouldn't be until the 1740s that they would outlaw it again. And so everyone kind of understood that this was an issue that was going to continue, and that the Republicans really wanted to start moving on the issue. So they officially banned slavery in the territories pretty much as soon as they gained office in 1861. But then but during the war itself, they made slavery an issue. Now, you'll hear people saying that that Lincoln made slavery an issue in 1863 when he brought out the Emancipation Proclamation. But in fact, the Union was already in the process of freeing slaves due to what's called the Confiscation Acts. The first of these was passed on the 15th of July, 1861. So just a couple of months after the war started, they passed one of these. And it specifically stated, all such property, as in used for the benefit of the Confederacy, including slaves, is hereby declared to be lawful subject of prize and capture wherever found. Essentially, they could confiscate slaves as war booty. This didn't mean that Civil War officers suddenly became slave owners, they confiscated them as contraband. This was experimented with on the on a island where a sea fort called Fort Monroe um, had already started receiving a number of runaway slaves um, who were seeking shelter at the Union fort. Um, and so they were declared contraband. Um, and the first confiscation act was kind of weak on it. They never even explicitly mentioned slaves, and it wasn't clear whether or not after the insurrection was over if the southern slave owners would be able to gain back their slaves. Um, so in March of 1862, they passed another one specifically stating that it was that it prohibited from employing any of the forces under their respective commands for the purpose of returning fugitives from service or labor. So by March of 1862, the Union Army is already acting as a force for freeing slaves. And in fact, they kind of were doing that from the beginning with Fort Monroe. So the contraband decree had made it so, and they continued to escalate that. Now remember, they had to deal with the border states who still had legal slavery, but were also still in the Union. Even when West Virginia basically seceded from Virginia, so they seceded from secessionists, they still had legal slavery until 1865. Though they weren't admitted into the Union until they had passed a number of restrictive laws, basically saying that they would gradually manumit all slaves over the course of 5 years. Those 5 years weren't up by the time that slavery was made illegal in the entire United States. But Lincoln was kind of hesitant to free slaves so brazenly, and to make slavery the ultimate issue of the Civil War. But his commanders, especially John C. Fremont, remember he had ran for the presidency back in 1856, were less subtle about it. And Fremont put out his own edict. He was in charge of the far western theater, basically anything that was beyond the Mississippi. After all, that's where he had been most successful as a military commander back during the Mexican-American War. And he specifically put out an edict declaring that all slaves were free if he was to run into them during operations, essentially just following the confiscation acts. But he said this in August of 1861, and in 2 months later, Lincoln removed him because this was a step too far. Even though he was essentially saying that he was just interpreting the Congressional Act to free slaves, this was a problem because now the border states saw this as potentially threatening their slavery as well, and Lincoln needed to keep those border states within the Union lest more power be added to the Confederacy. So, you can kind of understand Lincoln's position here, that he couldn't move on the issue of slavery too quickly. But there's a lot of arguments among historians about whether or not Lincoln was was eventually going to try to emancipate all slaves, or if the Republican Party kind of forced him to. Remember, Lincoln was elected as kind of a moderate, as opposed to John C. Fremont before him, who had very blatantly said that slavery was one of the two barbarisms that he wanted to eliminate. Um, but so Lincoln kept on kind of bouncing back and forth about whether or not he was going to free slaves. As late as August of 1862, he published a letter in Horace Greeley. You might remember Horace Greeley as that very pro-Western expansion guy. He ran a newspaper in New York called the New York Journal. New York Tribune, and Greeley was also a very staunch Republican. And Lincoln published a now very famous statement on his idea of the purpose of the war when he said, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." Now, one thing about this letter is that he was actually already drafting what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation at this point. The Emancipation Proclamation specifically stated that if the Confederacy did not give up, that the Union Army would essentially free all slaves within the rebellious territories. All slaves within those states would be emancipated as soon as the army gained control of those states. And in fact, he would publish it as a threat only a month after that statement. So he was trying to move on the issue of slavery, but he was kind of vacillating back and forth, trying to play this diplomatic game and not make the war worse than it already was. But on January of 1863, that was the ultimate outcome. And so what this comic here is talking about, when he's talking about the last card that he could play, this is representing the Emancipation Proclamation, him basically saying, if you do not surrender, I will emancipate your slaves. So this pretty much prevented foreign intervention. No one intervened, and the Confederacy was never recognized by any significant power. The only power to actually recognize the Confederacy as an independent country was the Vatican, and this is not a point when the Vatican was considered an independent state, because it was currently under siege by the Italians, and would remain under siege by the Italians throughout this entire war. So they don't really count. Also, it's the Vatican; it's a city. The Papal States were no longer really a thing at this point. So literally, the Confederacy went unrecognized and without any foreign interference. So Lincoln did pretty well in terms of keeping the Confederacy from having that foreign intervention. The Trent Affair was worrisome for sure, especially when Britain started gathering troops in Nova Scotia. But the Lincoln managed to navigate that pretty well. So the war itself continued and would continue all the way until 1865. So generally, it's divided into three theaters. There is the Eastern Theater, which is just this tiny little area right here. It's basically Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. That would be considered the Eastern Theater. Basically, only General Lee's army. And what the Union could muster against him, even though the capital, Washington, D.C., is right here, and Richmond is right here. So they're right next to each other. And this is where most of the fighting would be throughout the war. But there's also the Western Theater, which is kind of a misnomer because it includes, North Carolina and South Carolina. But at the beginning of the war, the Western Theater was very much just over here, trying to fight along the Mississippi and Ohio River and throughout Kentucky, eventually making it into Tennessee. And of course, there's the Trans-Mississippi Theater, which, while it is this giant swath of territory, the problem was it's kind of the misbegotten child of the Civil War. There was a bunch of fighting in Missouri and Kansas. Arkansas saw some raiding, and Louisiana was split pretty early on. Also, New Mexico would see a lot of fighting, but all of this was small compared to everything else. What is forgotten about these theaters is that there's a larger issue throughout the West in terms of fighting against Indians. And so one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of stuff happened because of the lack of federal troops in the West, as all those troops started heading east to fight in Virginia or in the Western Theater, basically allowing for an increase in violence in the West. And we'll see later that this ends up causing a lot of mayhem. So keep in mind, Eastern Theater is Virginia, basically only Virginia, and when Virginia tried to invade the North. And then the Western Theater is basically everything else that is east of the Mississippi, and Trans-Mississippi Theater is the far west. So Lincoln decided that he wanted to try to take Richmond first. Richmond and DC are only 100 miles apart, so they figured that they could win the war quickly by taking Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. This didn't work out so well. They could see very early on when when the first invasion of Virginia happened in June of 1861, the Union was not faring so well, and the first Battle of Bull Run really exposed this, also known as the Battle of Manassas, when the Union ended up retreating basically all the way back to Maryland, because they had failed to invade Virginia. And so they had a number of other campaigns. For instance, they tried to go through the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is, if you've ever heard of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it's on the eastern side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, basically this line around here. Like, if you've ever heard the song Country Road, it's supposedly about West Virginia, except for all of its landmarks are actually in Virginia. The song Country Road is actually more about Virginia, as in Eastern Virginia. because the Blue Ridge Mountains are kind of the thing that separate West Virginia from Virginia. And so they tried to go down the Shenandoah Valley. That didn't work out. And also, they tried to take the this little peninsula right here. It's called the Peninsular Campaign. And this little peninsula is actually like, where Jamestown was, and Colonial Williamsburg and all that kind of stuff. So the old empire, what's called the Old Empire of Virginia, Old Dominion, of Virginia, fighting over that land again, like it was the 1630s, but they didn't do too well either. General Lee was a superbly good general at defense, and so every invasion in 1861 through early 1862 failed. This culminated in another Battle of Bull Run, known as the Second Battle of Bull Run, in August of 1862. And yet again, that led to a Union retreat. But this time, the Confederacy went on the offensive. And so on September of 1862, Lee invaded the Union. And he invaded Maryland with 55,000 troops, which was actually the largest troop movement of the war up until that point. So they were essentially going to try to take Washington, D.C. D.C. had been fortified. There were perimeter forts all along it, but Lee's idea was that he was going to come up from here and swoop around and hit DC from the north. Obviously, this is a bit of a problem for Lincoln, especially when Robert E. Lee allows for slave raiding. Essentially, he allowed his officers to start raiding into northern settlements and grabbing up any black person they saw, regardless of their actual slave status, and taking them for the Confederacy. This obviously outraged a lot of Northerners, especially when they were taking freemen, not just slaves. And this is when Lincoln released the threat of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lee invaded on the 4th of September, and Lincoln announced it on the 22nd of September of 1862. So, very much in relation to all of this happening. And in the Emancipation Proclamation, he specifically stated that it would be implemented on January 1st, 1863, saying, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people in rebellion, people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforth and forever free. So he used this as kind of a way of counteracting the Confederacy, and this especially became a powerful statement because it was 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, which was essentially the Confederacy's own Bull Run. They failed to advance into Maryland and attack Washington, D.C., And at the Battle of Antietam, they were routed and sent back across into the Confederacy. So the this was kind of a turning point, not so much in terms of the actual success of the war, but definitely in terms of the fear of diplomatic intervention. As soon as he released that Emancipation Proclamation, it was very clear that the Union was fighting a war to end slavery, not just to keep the Union. This also was a turning point in terms of recruitment, because even though conscription was being fought in New York and everything, this suddenly became a rallying cry for people of color to join, especially Black people who wanted to free their brethren in chains. And on the 22nd of May, 1863, notably after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, the first all-Black unit was created. And in fact, 178,000 Black people would end up serving in the Union Army. That's roughly around 9% of Union troops. So almost a tenth of the Union Army would end up being Black. And they were also kind of some of the most fierce fighters because, well, they're fighting to free their brethren in chains. But unfortunately, this didn't end up going so well. The war still didn't go so well for the Union, because, of course, the Union tried to invade Virginia again, and failed. The Army of the Potomac was formed on the 11th of December, 1862, in response to the Confederate invasion, but the Battle of Chancellorsville from April to in May of 1863 sent the Union scurrying back to the North. And this battle was kind of huge because it ended up killing 30,000 people, 30,000 casualties. Okay, it didn't kill 30,000, it had 30,000 casualties. Casualties doesn't necessarily mean fatalities. It includes the wounded as well and missing. But because of the Union loss at Chancellorsville, of course, the Confederacy tried to invade again. But this time, Lee thought that he could make it all the way to New York. And so he went boldly from June of 1863, just due north into Pennsylvania. Obviously, Pennsylvania is the opposite direction of DC. Here's DC right here, and you can see where Pennsylvania is. Going due north is not going towards DC. And the Union Army had to regroup and try to stop him from getting all the way to New York. And so they met in Gettysburg. Gettysburg is about here. And the Union managed to defeat Lee in open battle. They were pretty successful on guarding their flanks. They had cavalry forces trying to swing around and hit the rear of the Union formation, but that was stopped by the Union cavalry. And then up on a hilltop called Little Round Top, a Confederate charge up the hill didn't manage to take it. And a Union charge with fixed bayonets managed to stop the flanking, another attempt to hit the Union flank, which was in a kind of L shape, um, failed to get through. So Robert E. Lee, in a last desperate attempt to continue the invasion, sent um, sent the sent his commander, um, General Pickett, to try to literally charge the strongest part of the Union's main line right through the middle across a open field, um, and just tried to break the line because it was his last attempt to continue the invasion. And that failed spectacularly. He had to, Pickett had to march a mile in the open. And of course, this was a tremendous, Gettysburg was a tremendous loss for the Confederacy, and is typically seen as kind of the turning point of the war. Because Lee would never go on the offensive again. And it's also one of the deadliest battles in U.S. history, causing 51,000 casualties. 51,000 over the course of 3 days. And that split is near even, that the Confederacy lost almost as much as the Union, but remember, the Union could afford those casualties. And so Lincoln rode out to the battlefield after it was completed, and Lee had went scurrying back to the Confederacy, and he gave one of the most famous addresses, one of the most famous speeches in American history, to commemorate the battlefield. It's that typical 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, blah, blah, blah. Basically saying, this is the cause of freedom, and that the people who died here did not die in vain, for we are ending slavery. So this is kind of the turning point, but it's also not really what was a decisive victory, because Gettysburg is just the end of a Confederate invasion, not the end of not the turning point of actual warfare. That happened in the Eastern Theater. I guess we're going to Trans-Mississippi first. The Eastern Theater, Western Theater. So the Western Theater would actually be the turning point. But first, we've got to talk about the Trans-Mississippi Theater, because it's complicated, but we don't really have a lot of time to talk about it. There was a bunch of raiding, kind of like what had happened in Bleeding Kansas, with Confederate bushwhackers. On the 21st of April, just a few days after Fort Sumter, the Confederacy passed the Partisan Ranger Act, basically to pay for civilians to raid border states. And the bushwhackers, especially with the Quantrill's Raiders, who formed in mid-1861, kind of turned Missouri and Kansas into a guerrilla war. These guys were particularly brutal. For instance, on the 6th of August, 1862, after the Battle of Kirksville in Missouri, 368 Union soldiers were massacred by these raiders. The Texas was rounding up anyone who had Union sympathies, leading to the Great Hanging of Gainesville, where Texas, in a series of hangings, hanged 42 Unionists, mostly German immigrants. And then they even attacked a German Unionist stronghold, killing another 32 in the process. So just massacres all over the place. In Centralia, as late as 1864, the Union had turned around and massacred 123 raiders. So, this is really nasty. Out in Missouri and Kansas and Arkansas and Texas. And Quantrill's raiders got so nasty that in Lawrence, Kansas, they attacked in August of 1863, killing 164 civilians, which led to the Confederacy repealing the Ranger Act in 1864, and Quantrill's raiders kind of splitting up. One of those raiders happening to be a very famous thug named Jesse James. And that's kind of where he got his start with all the violence that would come under his reign. And even as far as California saw some of this, with in March of 1861, for instance, the Los Angeles formed the Mounted Rifles, who ended up serving in the Confederate Army. And in 1864, there was a series of raids in the gold fields to try to capture gold for the Confederacy. So this is going on all over the place, and perhaps the most significant of it was happening right here in New Mexico. Remember that this territory had actually seceded right here at this line, claiming to create a state called Arizona. Arizona was actually originally a Confederate state, Confederate territory, and right along this line, this kind of oblong shape. And Texas invaded their own territory in July of 1861, taking a hold of La Mesilla, which was the capital of Confederate Arizona. But even though they imposed martial law on that, they didn't go any further until February of 1862, when they started trying to go due north towards the Colorado River with the hope that they could march along the Colorado River and invade Southern California. Basically, northern New Mexico was kind of just a place that they got waylaid, but they managed to get as far north as here in Albuquerque, took over the garrison here, and made it a stronghold. But as they tried to avoid Santa Fe itself, they marched north and were stopped in battle in a eastern valley. And so they were defeated by a lot of local New Mexicans, led by a Coloradan militia. and sent packing. And this ended the Confederate Arizona as well. And California sent its own troops, who arrived just after the Confederates were routed, and imposed martial law on the entirety of New Mexico. Eventually, Arizona would be split during this war, and split the way that we think of it today. But that would happen only under the California column's martial law. One of the people who was part of this California column was a guy named Kit Carson, a really famous Westerner. General Carson would end up fighting Navajos instead once he arrived under General Carleton. Carleton sent him westward to fight Navajos, who had continued raiding ever since 1848. They had continually raided and killed hundreds of New Mexicans. And so Kit Carson was sent out to finally end this. And in the first act of what's called Total War, he burnt everything in their main their kind of central valley called the Canyon de Chelly, and burned all of their orchards and everything, and rounded them up into a large group to march all the way to what's called Bosque Redondo. This is known as the Navajo Long Walk because it was kind of like the Trail of Tears, where they were being rounded up and put on a reservation. This is also the beginning of the modern reservation system. And this would end up, the Long Walk would end up killing more than 200, well, the Long Walk and the fighting associated with it would end up killing around over 200 Navajos in the process. And many more would die in the terrible conditions at Bosque Redondo until their paroling in 1868. So this kind of shows that the Indian Wars did not end, and in fact kind of got worse, especially when you think of it as one historian called it Greater Reconstruction, which is more about like determining race in the United States. And so remember, we've talked about the California genocide already, but it was kind of dying down by 1859, and there was a sudden increase in violence from 1862 to 1867, which killed hundreds, if not thousands. Then there was the Dakota War, which, with a lack of Union presence in Minnesota, the Dakota tribe, one of the groups of the Sioux tribes, figured that they could take advantage of this. When 4 Dakotas ran into some settlers and ended up killing 5 of them in a dispute, the entire tribe decided to go on the offensive, and so they went on a preemptive strike with 150 warriors throughout Minnesota, killing between 500 and 800 settlers. This is actually the worst massacre in the Indian Wars during the United States Indian Wars, and it was perpetrated by Dakotas. Obviously, Lincoln didn't like that. He reported it to be 800, but some historians have only been able to gather evidence for a little over 500 people killed. So this uprising was pretty quickly put down, obviously. Um, he's shifted a bunch of troops to go and put it down, and they were going to hang around 500 people, 500 Dakotans in response to this, while even while the Dakotans were rounded up on an island under horrible conditions, just the same way that had happened with the Navajos. And Lincoln actually pardoned most of them, but in the largest mass hanging on U.S. soil, 38 of them were hanged. So this is pretty nasty stuff, and it gets even worse in Colorado. Remember that that Colorado had kind of helped New Mexico to fend off the Confederacy? Well, when they returned, a group of Indians called the Dog Soldiers had been raiding throughout the mine country and outlying settlements, and they'd been doing so since at least 1862. But on the 29th of November, 1864, so basically in the winter, as pictured here, a Coloradan militia unit, known as the Third Colorado, under the same commander who had basically saved New Mexico, raided what they were thinking was a batch of dog soldiers who happened to include women and children. In fact, were mostly women and children. And so this was actually a completely peaceful band of Cheyennes. Dog soldiers were up in the mountains, and they should have known better because it was pretty close to a Union fort that specifically said that it was a peaceful, that they were not hostile Indians. But Third Colorado did what Third Colorado does, and ended up massacring between 70 and 200 Cheyennes. This is known as the Sand Creek Massacre. And all of this was in retaliation for some minor raiding. The Dog Warriors instead heightened their raiding, and the war continued there until 1865, and actually would continue a little bit in Wyoming all the way until 1868. So really bad move on the Union's part. And the same kind of thing happened in and around Utah. Utah had also been having a bunch of raids by Shoshones from 1858 to 1862, and this culminated in the 1860 Utter Party Massacre, which killed 29. And Shoshones were so brazen that they actually managed to stop immigrants going towards California in 1862. So in January of 1863, the Union Army arrived to stop this with a batch of California volunteers, many of whom who had actually fought in the California genocide. So they campaigned to try to stop the Shoshones, and managed to gather them up in around a small inlet called the Bear River. And on January 29th of 1863, they killed around 250 Shoshones. and gathered up the remainder and sent them to a pretty brutal reservation. So all of this is happening in the Far East and should not be forgotten. There's a lot of nasty stuff. Also, Oklahoma itself is having kind of its own civil war. That shouldn't be forgotten either. But it's kind of a civil war unto itself. And but the Western theater is where the war really turned around. In the West, which was commanded by Ulysses S. Grant, well, not initially, but eventually, they managed to fight to first stop Confederate invasions of Kentucky, and then at the Battle of Shiloh, the Union rescued another Union unit that was atop a hill, and kind of was decisive in taking Tennessee. There'd still be it was a strong foothold. They wouldn't really defeat the Confederacy until October of 1862 in Tennessee, but at that point, after the Battle of Corinth on October of 1862, Tennessee was back in the Union. And so Ulysses S. Grant used that as an opportunity to continue the Anaconda Plan. At the same time, the Union was gaining a foothold in New Orleans. They managed to take a sea fort in April of 1862, and only a month later, they managed to capture New Orleans itself. And so a kind of pincer movement along the Mississippi, first from the south, trying to work its way up into Arkansas, and another from the north trying to work its way down to Arkansas, was being fought along the Mississippi. Also, the Union had, once the Union took New Orleans, they controlled the Mississippi itself and were able to send gunboats. That's why in this picture you can see gunboats just firing off in the distance. This pincer movement was finally completed at Vicksburg, when in May of 1863, Grant, who's pictured right here, laid siege to Vicksburg for over a month. It did not end in, it did end in Confederate surrender, but only on the 4th of July, 1863. This was the turning point of the war, because the Confederacy was now split in two. Texas, Louisiana, the tribes that were part of the Confederacy in Oklahoma, and Arkansas were now split off from the Confederacy, and the Confederacy could no longer return from that, and so Grant sent General Sherman to start going into Georgia, who managed to take Atlanta on the 2nd of September, 1864, burning a good chunk of it to the ground. There's a lot of argument over whether or not Sherman actually wanted that, but Sherman halted there as Grant, now a supremely successful commander, was promoted to being in control of the entire Union Army. And let's hope we can get through this. With Grant as supreme commander of the entire Union Army, he was able to refocus on Virginia. Um, so by mid 1863, the writing's on the wall for the Confederacy. You know, Grant was not in charge of the Union Army during Gettysburg, but Gettysburg was was happening simultaneously to Vicksburg, and so with the taking of Atlanta in Georgia, and Tennessee is completely overrun, and the Mississippi is splitting the Confederacy in half. Um, Grant is put in charge and decides to just march. Doesn't matter the casualties. He wanted to end this war as quickly as possible. And so he started well, as it says, a relentless push southward. And he managed to push into a forest in northern Virginia known as the Wilderness. And they kind of got stopped there initially by the Confederates, who halted the Union advance. And what's worse is that the forest caught on fire. And so all the people on both sides of the forest could hear the cries of the dead and dying as they were being burnt alive, and no one could rescue them. This is, absolutely horrible. And, lesser commanders of the Union Army would have retreated from that, but Grant decided to push right on through the wreckage. And this was a good decision because he managed to get all the way to Petersburg. Petersburg is just south of Richmond. And essentially, he was laying siege to Richmond by June of 1864. This ended up being a bunch of trench warfare in that. So this kind of halted the Union advance, and they wouldn't actually take Richmond until the 2nd of April, 1865. So Grant turned to what is often called total war. And essentially, his idea was that he was going to burn anything within Union sites. And he started this in the Shenandoah Valley, where he wrote a letter specifically saying to General Sheridan, who was in charge of that campaign, that to eat out Virginia clear and clean as far as they go, so that crows flying over it for the balance of this season will have to carry their provender with them. As in, literally make the Shenandoah Valley a wasteland. And he also told Sherman, who was still in Atlanta, on the 15th of November, 1864, to start marching towards the sea. And so Sherman did, tearing up the tracks everywhere he went and pretty much allowing his troops to do whatever they wanted to the landscape around. They were burning crops and everything, and there was like some rape in that going on as well, though that was explicitly against Sherman's orders. But when you're marching an army on an empty stomach and literally telling them to destroy everything in their path, bad stuff is going to happen. This is what total war does. And the idea is that by making this area economically not be able to provide, they were going to end the war. And in fact, that pretty much worked. Sherman made it all the way to the sea in December of 1864 and started marching north into South Carolina, reaching the capital of South Carolina. And remember, they were the ones who started the war. They were the first to secede. They were the ones who were, the nullification crisis before that. And they had been the ones to fire on Fort Sumter and had remained relatively untouched throughout all of this. And so they managed to arrive at the capital, Columbia, South Carolina, on the 17th of February, 1865. And of course, it got burnt down. Though one of the interesting things that happened there was that that a group of soldiers actually met in the legislature there and officially passed an act, if that can count as officially passing an act, rescinding secession. So one could argue that the end of the war was then. But with all of this, Lee was managing to hold out, at least until April of 1865, when he was cornered in Appomattox. And so Lee surrendered to General Sherman then. This essentially ended the war, though there would be a number of lingering conflicts. For instance, the last tribe to surrender was on the 26th of May at Camp Napoleon, and the last Confederate ship to surrender, the CSS Shenandoah, didn't surrender until November of 1865, and they surrendered in London. So there was still lingering fighting, but essentially in April, the war was over. And in fact, on the 10th of May, 1865, Jefferson Davis was captured as he tried to flee Richmond and head southward. And he was wearing a lady's dress, trying to hide out. He'd end up being imprisoned for years after this. But essentially, the war was over, and the Confederacy had been defeated, but not without massive casualties. And we don't have a lot of time, so I will leave it for next week. But suffice it to say, this is the deadliest war America ever fought. And, we can argue over whether or not it was worth it, instead of passing manumission in less lethal ways. Because there's around 2 million casualties from this war. 2 million. That's a lot of casualties. So we will get to that next week, and talk about the end of the war and then also Reconstruction. Hold on a second while I turn. No, that's not what I wanted. There we go. So, before we go, it's time to end. Are there any questions?
You said that Lee surrendered to Sherman, but he surrendered to Grant, not Sherman.
Did I say Sherman?
Yeah, you said Sherman.
Oh, no, I meant Grant. Yeah. Sherman was down in South Carolina. He was not in Virginia. Sorry for the confusion. Good of you to point it out. Thanks. Are there any questions though? You guys can type it in or anything along those lines. Or unmute yourself and say it. Any questions? All right. Well, we will talk about the cost of the war and its effects on next Tuesday. Hopefully, some of you actually will be seeing your family and everything. Have a good Thanksgiving. We will not be having class until
You as
Tuesday.
well.
Did you have a question?
No, just wanted to say thank you as well.
Have a good day.